A Father's Promise, Chapter 14, The Sacrifice, November 1939. Take now thy son, thine only son, whom thou lovest. Genesis 22:2a. A week had passed since Mr. Sursick's homecoming, and it had been a good week, for after that initial conversation, Rudy's father was able to talk freely to the Sursicks about Christ. For several days they all met together in the late afternoon to study and to talk about the prophecies in the Old Testament. Dr. Kaplan showed them passage after passage foreshadowing Christ as the Messiah. After so many years of prayer, it seemed that Rudy and Mr. Sursick's heart was at last softening. Yes, it had been a good week until today. That afternoon, the Gestapo had paid his father a visit and had given him the ultimatum. He was to treat all typhoid patients with the standard medication, Ulirin. Dr. Kaplan refused. Although the Germans did not openly threaten him, their visit aroused Rudy's deepest fears. It cast a shroud of sorrow over his father that seemed to blot out the joys of the previous week. Now it was well into the night, and Rudy could not sleep. He lay on the sofa in the dark corner of the room and watched his father, who was sitting at the table, hovering over his Bible. The flame from the lantern on the table made the frost of his breath barely visible and threw fanciful shapes upon the wall. At the same time, however, Rudy noticed that it cast harsh shadows across his father's face, making him look worn and solemn. Dr. Kaplan looked up from his Bible and gazed for several moments into the lantern's flame. Then he stood up and with a decisive air made his way across the room to the sofa where Rudy lay. "Rudy," he said quietly. Rudy did not answer, for he felt that his father intended to tell him something he did not want to hear. "Rudy," his father repeated. "Are you awake, son?" "Yes," Rudy finally admitted. "We have to talk," his father said as he placed his hand gently on Rudy's shoulder. Rudy got up slowly, buttoned his coat, and followed him to the lighted corner of the room. "Sit down, son," his father began. "I have something to tell you that is difficult for me to say." He stopped and looked down. For several moments he continued, but still he did not look up. "I think you know already that the Nazis will be back for me. I cannot do anything to avoid them. But I can see to it that you are out of their reach. If they take you, they will have to take me too," Rudy said doggedly. His father's voice was quiet. "No, son, you cannot come with me." The words shot through Rudy like an arrow. "But I have to go with you," he protested. "I have to." His father looked up, and as the light fell across his face, Rudy could see his tears glistening in his eyes. He had never seen his father cry, and the very sight also made his eyes well up with tears. "Rudy," Dr. Kaplan continued, "I've heard reports about the place where they will send me. Many believe the reports are exaggerated, and a few weeks ago I might have believed so too, but since that time I have seen what the Nazis are capable of." He hesitated. "I'm afraid you couldn't survive such a place." "Yes, I could," Rudy argued. His father's voice took the tone of reasoning. "Even if that were true, do you think they'd let us stay together once they got us to the camp?" "No, I assure you they would not. That's why I've spent hours this past week praying, asking God to show me what I ought to do. And He has. He has given me a promise that if I let you go, He will keep you." "Go?" asked Rudy. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you will have to leave here and get away before the Germans come back for me." "But where, Papa?" cried Rudy. "Where am I to go?" "Into the forest," said his father. Rudy stared at him in disbelief. "I have a plan," Rudy's father continued before Rudy could offer an argument. "I've talked with a friend of mine, a former patient. His brother Oscar was one of the many who managed to escape into the forest and join a resistance group there. He's been in contact with him, and he told me that Oscar will be able to help you. He's already been notified that you are coming." Rudy tried desperately to think of some argument that would change his father's mind, but before he could do so, his father pulled out a carefully drawn map from his trousers pocket and went on. Our first job is to get you out of the city. I've spent the last few days finding an escape route for you. There is one, only one. From what I can tell, it is here, he said, pointing to a spot on the map very close to the place where we dug the trenches with Salek and his father. You remember? Yes, but his father dared not hesitate. But taking these back streets, he said, carefully going over each step, you can reach that entrance. When you arrive, look for this place in the barbed wire fence that the Nazis have erected. Right above here, just this side of where we were digging that morning. You will find that the bottom wire is loose enough for you to lift it up and slide under. Of course, you must wait until the guard has turned his back, and you must be quick about it. I've watched other children go in and out this way. They escape daily into the fields in search of food and return just as it is getting dark. An adult could never get under the wire. That's why the Germans haven't noticed it. But you must be careful, Rudy. His father's voice was earnest. I'm not going, Papa, Rudy said. I'm not leaving you. His father sat for a long while, staring down at the map before he finally spoke again. Rudy, I want to tell you something I've never told anyone else, and I don't know if I would have ever told you had we not been brought to this place. But it may help you understand, or at least have faith enough to accept what I'm saying. Nothing could. Just listen for a moment, his father interrupted. It's about your mother's death. Rudy quieted, for it was the first time his father had actually mentioned his mother's death. Though his father often talked about her, it always seemed to Rudy that he spoke as if she had merely taken a journey and was soon to return. You see, Rudy, he began, you're not the only one who had to escape by faith what you could not understand. Except by faith what you could not understand. It was never difficult for me to lose your mother. When I learned that she was dying, my first reaction was fear. I could not imagine going on without her, nor could I imagine rearing you all by myself. You were so small and helpless, and I was, so clumsy. After the initial shock, however, I grew angry. I was angry with myself because I, a doctor, could do nothing to help the person I loved more than anyone else in the world. And I was angry with God as well. Surely, I reasoned, if he loved us, he would not make us suffer so. I'm ashamed to say this, but I grew more bitter as she grew weaker. Of course, I hid it from her, for she continued to trust in God all through her illness, and my lack of faith would have hurt her deeply. When she died, I almost despaired. And the only thing that kept me going was my love for you. You needed me. Rudy and I couldn't let you down. In his mercy, God began to work on me to heal the hurt I felt and to bring me closer to him again. But even after I'd accepted his will for us and had begun to trust him once again, I still did not understand until 2 months ago, on the night the Germans evicted us from our apartment. As I stood before your window and watched Mr. Kaminsky's children and husband being torn from her, I understood that God had taken your mother home because he loved her. You see, son, your mother was very strong, but she had two weak points, you and me. Your mother was a Gentile, and eventually she would have faced the same horror Mrs. Kaminsky faced, Rudy. To lose us in such a manner would have been far more painful for her than any illness. I can now say that I am glad to know that she's in God's presence. I'm grateful that I shall never be forced to leave her in the hands of Nazis. It seems that he he could have waited a little longer before taking her, said Rudy. No, son, the Lord knew that I needed several years to grow without her. Several years before I had the faith to face what I face now. Please, Papa, pleaded Rudy. I know you are young, Rudy, and I know that you have not lived long enough to look back and see God's hand in circumstances. Still, you do know that I love you as much as any father could, and that I would never ask you to do such a hard thing, if I were not absolutely certain God is in it. Absolutely certain that it's the right thing to do. I just can't go alone. Yes, you can. Any boy who is clever enough to execute a plan like you did in returning to our old apartment can carry out this plan as well. That was different, said Rudy. Yes, in many ways it was much more dangerous, and it was unnecessary. This time it is necessary. Rudy knew that his father was waiting for some word of assurance from him, but he could not bring himself to offer any. Please, Rudy, please trust me, his father begged. Trust me as I trust my heavenly Father. I promise you, as he has promised me, if you go, you will see the end of this war. But what about you, Papa? Rudy asked desperately. I don't know. All that I can promise you is that we will see each other again. If not in this life, then in the next. But here, Rudy, is the promise God has given me to assure me of your safety. He turned his Bible toward Rudy and pointed to the verse. Let's read it together. Rudy looked down, but try as he would, he could not focus on the words. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. He heard his father say, the forest is God's secret place for you, Rudy. There you shall be under his shadow, where you will be safe. Please, son, please, don't let me down. When must I go? Rudy finally managed to say. As soon as we can get you ready, Dr. Kaplan told him. Rudy ran to his father, threw his arms about him, and burying his face in his father's chest, he wished with all his heart that he could stay there until the darkness was past.